Alan. Thank you, Dwight. Thank you, everyone here, for putting up with this. Me. We've been listening. This is a very eclectic presentation, and I think that will be brought home very clearly now when you listen to me. We've been hearing about all the wonderful things that everyone has done since their years in Vienna, how they launched them on, the careers that took them to such wonderful places. Since I can't do that, I'll talk about the years that I spent in Bangladesh, and digress as I lose the thread. And I did this in between 6 and 12 minutes at home this morning, so it'll vary depending on how I... In 1972, I graduated, and that summer received a note from Selective Service congratulating me on my acceptance into the U.S. Army. We had some correspondence, and I explained that I didn't think I'd be a good fit in the Army, and I hadn't heard anything very attractive about Vietnam. Maybe I said it'd be better if I gave 2 years of my life to a nonprofit somewhere in the world, doing something more valuable than shooting at the people who lived there. We came to an agreement on those terms, and I approached Gray Bryan at VI3A, who told me of a unique opportunity that he'd just become aware of in Asia. The relief agency CARE needed a mechanic to oversee its local shop, and with it their fleet of cars, motorcycles, trucks, and boats. I was 22 years old at the time, and I had owned a series of jalopies since high school, under whose hoods I had been forced to learn a bit of mechanical skill. It's a measure of their desperation that I was accepted for the CARE position based on that resume. My best guess is there wasn't a long line of better qualified candidates. The job was in Dacca, Bangladesh. I had to look it up on a globe. To get there, I learned wasn't going to be straightforward. VI3A made all the various arrangements, though, and a week before I left, they gave me a thick pack of tickets. A friend flipped through them and marveled, "You're going to Calcutta, India, to connect to someplace." I arrived in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. I got off the airplane and was met and taken to a house that I would share with other staffers as they came in and out of the country from time to time. At that moment, it was just me and a Danish fellow who was being medically evacuated for jaundice the next day. I was introduced to my house staff. I had a house staff. I don't know how many volunteers can say that. I had 5. I had a house staff, 5. I had a cook. I had a houseboy. I had a couple of guys I didn't understand. One guy slept in the driveway, and about 2 years later, just before I left, I learned he'd been my security. Which actually raises I digress, but a couple of days after I got there, I was woken up in the middle of the night. Somebody was banging on the windows. All the doors were locked, and there was bars on the windows. Somebody was banging on the windows and making a lot of racket outside, and the houseboy got up, went to the door and hollered at this person, and person's out there. It was hollering back and forth, and eventually they went away. And in the morning, I asked the houseboy, I said, what was that all about? He said, that dacoits. They were dacoits. I didn't know what that, so at a shop the next day, I said, what does the word dacoit mean? And they said, well, it means robbers. And so I went, note to self, lock doors at night. Anyway, in 1972, Dacca was still in a post-war state of fragile peace and disorder, a failed state without the success part. No private cars, no export economy, no tourism, no police, no phones, no stores except street markets or restaurants beyond street stalls. It was a hugely overcrowded, chronically flooded Islamic third world village, and I was moving in for 2 years. A friend of mine once described to me the experience of leaving an air-conditioned building during summer in the Middle East and being met by air heated to 120 degrees by the sun. The first impression is not heat, he told me. Your first impression is confusion. What is this? I had the same experience for a few weeks in Dacca. It wasn't the heat, though. It was the culture, the environment, and the poverty. I had a case of culture shock so bad I didn't even know what it was. On my first day at work, I was introduced to my crew, the guys I'd be working with. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, all of them older guys with grease under their fingernails, all except one, Lalu. Lalu was probably 8 or 9. He was the shop gopher. He was somebody's nephew. He hid behind one of the older guys as he was being introduced, and I was told he was very shy. He'll have to get over that soon, though, someone announced to the crowd. He's getting married in a few days. My shock must have shown because everyone suddenly looked concerned and quiet. Is everything all right, boss? And they called me boss. Even if I started being bad, they called me boss. Is there a problem? I mumbled something about Lalu seeming just a tad young in my mind. For matrimony, there was an awkward silence and the subject was changed. Until the next day, it was my second week in this new culture. The senior mechanic came up to me and took me aside and he said, Lalu took your advice. He called off his wedding. And when I say I experienced uber culture shock, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. When I came back to California 2 years later, I actually didn't talk about my Dacca days too much. I remember once early on, someone asked me for the one thing that I really took away from my 2 years there. I said, I've learned you cannot have a country without pencils. It just doesn't work. But in general, people didn't ask me that question, the many questions. I had a few stock anecdotes, mostly the casual, goofy stuff. So here's a sampling. Once I was invited to a dinner and sat next to the wife of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who choked on her food and informed me that my Bengali, that I was so proud of and that I'd learned on the fly from my good buddies at the shop, was actually extremely inappropriate and profane. Once I drove for 3 days to the Indian border towing 2 other trucks on pieces of rope. As we drove along, people walking on the road would run along and jump on board. And when the ropes broke, as they frequently did, volunteers would hop off and find some more. For 3 days, we limped along like that, a train creeping its way across the Bengali countryside with no tracks. We left those trucks at the Indian border, and coming back as we rode in a series of stupendously overcrowded buses. As the foreigner, I was always given the seat of honor, the driver's seat, along with the driver. We shared. I remember looking at the windshield directly into the eyes of the guys that stood on the front bumper and hung on to the windshield wipers. They were looking in enviously at those of us who were fortunate and wealthy enough to have seats inside. Another time I organized a crowd big enough to lift and carry by hand a farm tractor across a river. Then there was a time I found the carcass of a dead dog in front of my house. I paid some street kids to haul it off, and the next day I found 2 more dogs in the same place with the same kids hanging around. I call that story entrepreneurialism, Bengali style. I don't know about you, all you return volunteers, but personally, I haven't had that many opportunities over the years to go on like this. The subject of Bangladesh doesn't come up very often in casual conversation. In fact, these 10 minutes may be the longest sustained Bengali story-a-thon I've ever forced on anyone. So I will stop now with one more thought. Very little in my life today, in Silicon Valley 2013, reminds me of the specifics of those years. That's one of the reasons I hardly ever talk about them. Nothing triggers. But it would be profoundly untrue to say that I've forgotten them. When I sat down to write up these notes, it took no effort to bring it all right back, right down to the lovely smell of burning campfires made of tar trucks and the badly amplified voices of all the mullahs hollering calls to prayer from rickshaws twice every day. At the young age of 22 and 23, my theory is that the human brain is a particularly spongy organ. In Dacca, Bangladesh, 1973 and 1974 was a very powerful brew. In that time and place, I saw things, heard things, and felt things that are sometimes hard for me to imagine, but not hard for me to remember. They changed me, and nothing I have seen, heard, or felt since would be quite the same without that experience.